Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Crosswires. It's James here, and today we have a fantastic episode and a fantastic guest. Again, plunging into the depths of RMC Retro's Discord service to get our guests. I think I'm going to have to start paying Neil like royalties for guests at this point. But this is a topic that we're going to talk about today that, I've had quite a bit of involvement with. Well, certainly on one side of it. We're going to be talking a little bit about desktop publishing and vintage Macs and how the two actually come hand in hand together. So would you please welcome my guest today, Dan Vincent.
Hello, James. It's great to be here today. This wonderful technology allowing us to connect across the pond, as they say.
I love that term. Describing the Atlantic Ocean as a pond has always been one of my favourite things that people do. I'm like, that's definitely not a pond.
It is a charmingly British expression. That's the only way, that it could have come about.
Is it Google Maps? There was one of a mapping service where you put London to New York and it said swim.
We do not recommend that.
No, please don't attempt that. Even if you are the most experienced sea swimmer in the world, and I know someone who has done like the channel swim. Yeah. But no, don't do the Atlantic. Yeah. I mean,
Crossed Wires does not endorse the cool attempt of swimming across the Atlantic Ocean.
No, not at all. Definitely not. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, just a bit of background for folks. Not the reason Dan's here, but Dan very kindly stepped up to the plate when I said, hey, I'm moving soon. I need to record some episodes so I don't have to record while I'm tearing down over the studio. So thank you very much. Dan, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit of your background and
Sure.
What you do? Because you're a podcaster as well.
Yes, I do. We'll get it off started. Currently, the podcast that I'm doing is a sort of combo blog podcast thing because it's a scripted show. I write the scripts and record it, and sometimes I do an off-the-cuff thing, even though I believe that I'm better when I have a moment to think about something versus, just going and babbling all the time. That's called Userlandia. You can find it over at userlandia.com. Just getting ready, actually, on the finishing touches on the script for the next one, for the next Computers of Significant History. I'm not sure when like I said, I know you're banking these. I'm not sure when this will be out. Hopefully that will be out in towards the end of August, maybe mid-end of August. We'll see what it actually turns out. Because I do have an editor, a writing editor, fellow friend of mine that I work with, to make me a little more coherent. Mostly just to say, hey, are you sure about this, or whatever, so on and so forth. I mean, I figure a lot of people, when they introduce themselves in your show, I mean, we're both of the retro and vintage mind on here. And I mean, obviously, because we crossed paths via Neil's RMC Discord, which is a nice, great little community of maybe like-minded and not so like-minded individuals when it comes on which platform is the best platform, which, I always find that entertaining. I mean, a quick rundown of like my computing history. I mean, I know you're a Commodore guy. My first computer was a Commodore 64. So we had that until the wonderful year of 1997.
So that was quite a long run on the 64.
For ours. I mean, we kind of feels like, oh, you still have a Commodore. Well, we'll give you some of our Commodore stuff. And it just kind of hung around. And I tried, it's how it was in the 90s. I mean, my family was a very working class family. My dad and he was working by himself by the time eventually my mom wound up working as well. It's like just the idea of spending $2,000 or whatever on a new PC clone, not even a Mac, just a PC. It just wasn't in the cards. And I didn't even get my own IBM PC. Well, let me rephrase that. I picked up some computers from I was kind of doing retro before we were doing it today. Like I had picked up an old IBM PS2 286 in 1997, which shared space with the Commodore because I could use that to dial into local bulletin boards. And then all that eventually went away. My uncle took pity, or not so much pity, but he wound up buying a shiny new Pentium 2. So he's like, well, my Compaq needs a place to go. So he brought his Compaq 486 over to our house, and so that was our first like Windows-based machine. So now we could use the internet at home. Until then, it's like for me to use the internet, browse the web, I had to stay after school, because we had a computer lab and everything else there on Macintoshes. So that's basically it. And then from there, I mean, I was always a computer nerd, always a geek. Loved computer games, loved video games. I mean, we had a NES and a Super Nintendo, but after that point, my older brothers were old enough that they could buy the newer consoles, like a PlayStation and an N64. So that's how we shared with each other. My older siblings would buy it, and then they'd sort of lose interest, and then myself and my younger sister would kind of sneak in and say, "Okay, now while the cats are away, the mice will play." Like I said, I know you're a Commodore guy. I mean, I do have a bit of a soft spot for the Amiga, if only because, I mean, the guy who ran our Commodore user group, who lived up the street from us, had an Amiga, so I was able to see it. I believe he had an A1000 for a long time, as well as his other Commodore stuff. And the first bulletin board I dialed into actually ran on an A4000. This was in like 1997, and that was right when that was starting to become, especially here in the States. Even if your A4000 was tricked out with a bunch of stuff, it was getting really hard to stick with it, because by 1997, the whole SCOM thing had fallen through. It was 2 years away from Gateway buying and doing stuff with it. So it really was, difficult for somebody to still be an Amiga fan, and that stuff all went away. And of course, now we're kicking ourselves for getting rid of all of our stuff. We're trying to get it back. So for me, I'm not sure if this is the same for you, but for me, part of what I like about this retro stuff and vintage stuff, retro is an activity that you can perform on vintage hardware. I fall on that side of the divide, because you can do retro stuff on modern hardware.
Oh yeah. I mean, a great example being, the RetroPie on a, well, I was going to say relatively affordable Raspberry Pi, but relatively affordable and Raspberry Pi don't go in hand right now because of a chip shortage.
Everything's getting more expensive.
Oh, it's crazy. But the point being, you, as you said, you can, even on an x86 PC, you can run RetroPie. But yeah, with actual vintage hardware, there are certain pieces of vintage gear that I would love to own. I mean, as I've said on previous episodes when we've had Dan Wood on, I regret, it wasn't my decision, but I miss the A600. There are certain vintage Macs, and for me, when I look at vintage Macs, I talk anything PowerPC and older, really.
Yes.
But, so for me, I've always wanted a G4 lampshade. I've
got one right in the other side of the room. I mean, we're lousy with them here. It's like, if there's one thing that comes up on Craigslist every now and then, it's somebody looking to sell their iLamp for, whatever amount of money that they're willing to sell. I mean, for me, the only thing that does it's a digital picture frame. It's a very nice, pretty digital picture frame, but that's all I use it for, aside from, looking nice. And I think one thing that we might share on this, exploring this vintage stuff, it's like when we talk about across the pond, it's like for you guys, for me, learning about all of the storied history of British microcomputing over the past several years, for me, was a real sort of breath of fresh air. It's like, oh, here's a whole bunch of stuff I don't know about. I can, I just get into something and I just sort of, just pull it all in, and I sort of correct my own record on things. And, it's what they say about English. It's like we're two countries separated by a common language, or something like that. And it's very much the same way with computers. Even though we had Macs and IBMs, and you guys had Macs and IBMs, there was, you guys had the Amiga longer than we did, and the ST was much more popular over there than it was over here. But that's one thing that I find, it's like, it's two sides kind of, I mean, we like to rib each other every now and then, but I like how it's sort of these two sides sort of coming together and learning more about each other. I mean, that's what I really like about the retro scene. At least that's what I think.
No, I agree with you. And it's really interesting because you're echoing a comment that Ryan from Graphics Gear made in our last episode, where we were talking about the differences where, maybe in the US, classrooms would have been, as you said, classroom computer labs full of Macintoshes or earlier Apple IIs.
Yes.
Whereas here, it would have been, certainly in most primary schools, so elementary school for yourself and our American listeners, would have been probably BBC Micros or BBC Masters by the time I started primary school. And then going into high school, we had Acorn Archimedes, at least until all the labs got turned into... I think it was when Windows 98 became stable. I think this is what I'm saying with Ryan. When Windows 98 became stable, our computer labs started to become more and more just off-the-shelf, locally built...
beige boxes.
PCs. Yeah.
No more RISC PCs, no more Archies. It's... that's...
We had a RISC PC. We had a RISC PC in my lab. We weren't allowed to touch it. I don't think you'll ever listen to this show, so it's fine. We had two sort of computer teachers. One was very much like just a computer IT helper, and one was an actual IT teacher. But one of them, and I've forgotten my gentleman's name, which is probably a good thing, was always very grumpy with the students and blamed us if anything went wrong. And we weren't allowed to, have fun with his precious computers. Whereas the IT teacher, I remember having a vivid memory. He said, "Right, class, we're not going to do any studying today. You've studied hard enough. I want you to put this disk into your machines. It's going to boot you up into DOS, and we're going to play a game." And we ended up... Was it Doom? No, it wasn't Doom. It wasn't Doom Multiplayer. It was Quake.
Oh, wow.
We had the shareware Quake. And he said, "Right, if any of you tell the senior staff, you are in trouble." And
I love it.
I mean, our school network was so insecure.
They all were back then.
Awful. So, they had authentication on all the machines. And you would have thought that they had network authentication. No. So I had a laptop that I used and could plug into the network for printing and stuff. Well, I, without any authentication, was able to get into all of the school's files, including my friend's PE, phys ed, grade sheet.
Oh, no. Yeah, see, back then, it's this was before Windows NT. So when we were doing everything on Windows 9X, the security controls were just not... It's you could come up and say, "Oh, please log in on Windows 9X." It's escape key, and then, carry on or whatever. And God forbid, by default, if file sharing had any security turned on, the odds are it wasn't. That's... When Windows... XP came along and the majority of the school machines got the Windows XP or Mac OS X, all that went out the window and things wound up being a lot better. But you're not wrong. I mean, I had some tales too from back in the day from us enterprising middle schoolers who were, we were able to do a lot our old Macs in the labs, because as you're mentioning in the UK, you had BBCs and then you had the Archimedes until you went to PCs. For a lot of us here in the States, it was Apple IIs, and then those Apple IIs hung around in some cases for really long. Our middle school didn't get rid of all of ours until 1996, going on into 1997. There were still plenty of Macintoshes, but the Apple II still kind of hung on. But by I want to say the 1996 was when they really got into just getting rid of all of it. That was for us is schools still hung on to, we're still Macintoshes and so on and so forth for a really long time. Nowadays, it's all completely different. It's all Chromebooks and iPads and everything else. But it used to be that once upon a time, there was such a thing as the school computer, that at least for us, that's how I got into Macs was, using them in schools. Picture yourself, this is 1994. So I would have been in fourth grade. I was probably just 10. I'm an April baby, so I was probably just turning 11 years old. I mean, at that time, I already had a reputation of being a, computer geek. So there was me and one other kid in my class who's one of the teachers said, we've got something special for you. And in they wheel in the room on a cart, because this is how they had to do, this is in a grade school. Yep. So even though all the classrooms had one Apple II in all the grade school classrooms, there was the one Macintosh that was on a cart that could be wheeled around from room to room. And that was an LC2 with an Apple SCSI CD-ROM drive with the caddies.
Oh, wow.
So we had to be taught how to use the caddy, and on it was the Grolier's Encyclopedia of 1992. And I got to tell you, that was kind of a life-changing experience for me, just to say, first of all, actually learning what a Macintosh was, like getting taught, like, how does a mouse work? What do icons mean? How, the Commodore, when I was done, you just flip the switch and you were done. On a Mac, no, you can't do that on a Mac. You have to go Apple menu. Actually, no, it was special menu back then, and then shut down. And then when it said it's okay to turn off the computer, you could turn off. They had the inkjet printer. I mean, this machine back then, this is 1994, is an LC2. So that machine was still very, very new. They probably bought that a year prior. That whole setup probably cost something with the CD-ROM drive and the style writer. That was probably a $3,000, $3,500 setup. So, because an LC2 back then, just a base model was like $1,500, $1,600. A monitor on top of it was probably $500, $600. The CD-ROM drive had to be at least maybe $400, and then the printer was like, that's why they had it on the cart, so they could bring it from room to room and everybody could.
Yeah, because we could only afford one machine.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can't remember us. I mean, we had that with like TVs and video players, but
same.
I remember certainly in primary school, I think the computers were on carts, but I think we had it. We had them, but I would have been I started high school in 95, so and our school system's a little bit different, so our grades are different.
Yeah.
But I would have been 11. And that's when we had the Archimedes, and we just had loads of them. Let's jump into the whole vintage Mac thing, because you've certainly got a lot more experience. Now, my experience with Macs before I became a Mac user, which was quite a long time ago now, but I joined the Mac world. No pun intended.
I appreciate that.
I joined with a 2006 Intel Core 2 Duo iMac. Beautiful, it was gorgeous machine. But my previous experience had been my friend had a Performer, and he was a very loud and proud Mac user.
As they were back in the 90s. I know exactly the type of 90s Mac user that you're talking, which will be relevant to the topic of this show.
So obviously most people know that the Mac was introduced in 1984 by Steve Jobs with that famous hello and the famous...
The 1984.
And you know what? Again, great machine. It popularized... I'm going to be very careful because I don't want to say that it invented the GUI, because they didn't.
They didn't.
But it popularized it, brought it into, sort of general use, a GUI and a mouse. I'm going to guess most people's first experience with a mouse or any sort of GUI was a Mac.
Yeah, that's probably a fair thing to say. At least if you're of a certain vintage, like our vintage. The funny thing is, like, there's, as a computer, I can't call myself a historian. Saying I'm a historian is too, my degree is in art. I do not have a degree in library studies or anything that would make me qualified to say that I'm a historian. But as a person who likes to read a lot, and a person who's just, has a thirst for knowledge. The way that we talk about, how mice and pointing and clicking and GUIs and everything got invented is just so complex with so many, webs that tangle up into, like, everybody knows the classic story, as you said, here comes the Mac with all this and that, and there's always the contrarians that come in, and the contrarians will say, they wouldn't steal that from Xerox, they did. But apologies to all of my fellow British friends, because, like, for me, whenever I think of that sort of, and this is our American stereotypes coming through, it's like, we think of these sort of stuffy upper crust, types. We always associate that with, and, people say, I know there's at least 25 different accents all over England. People, I live in Massachusetts. Everybody thinks, like, why don't you sound like Pack the Con, Harvard? Yeah. Well, most people don't talk that way, but even around Boston, we have like 7 or 8 individual accents just inside, 128 alone, that's completely off the thing. But when you get to those people who like to be, I don't want to say contrarian, but they sort of have a thing where they say, oh, no, I don't like them getting the credit or whatever. But you look at what happened with Xerox. It's like, Xerox never would have been able to capitalize on any, and that's a common story with the things that lead up to desktop publishing. Xerox didn't capitalize on multiple things, which is why all that happened. But also, they actually changed and invented a lot of new stuff to make the Macintosh the Macintosh. Like if you look at Smalltalk, at the actual environment that ran on, the old Xerox machines, and then you look at what it became after when you had the Xerox Star and the further machines from Xerox, there were a lot of really interesting ideas and a lot of complexity in the user interface that came from that idea. Whereas you actually have these guys like Bill Atkinson and Andy Hertzfeld who took those ideas and went and did all sorts of things. Because what people don't realize is that what we had in the Mac and the overlapping windows and stuff, trying to do that on that level of hardware was unheard of. And they did it because Bill invented QuickDraw, and also for people listening, I don't have any reference materials up. I'm going completely off the top of my head from stuff that I've read a bazillion times over again. If I make a minor factual error, please forgive me. If there's anything I hate being wrong. So always feel free to correct me. But those guys invented QuickDraw because they thought that Xerox was doing these certain overlapping menus and Windows things, and it turns out they weren't. It was more difficult than that. And then the Xerox guys are like, well, wait a minute, how did you do that? And that's how you got guys who came from Xerox to Apple to work on also, like Larry Tesler. They hired Larry Tesler to come over to Apple, not just for stuff that he did at Xerox, but because they wanted him to be their programming guy. Like they're a guy who would say, who he really believed in object-oriented programming, and that's what they wanted to do on the Macintosh. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish.
Oh, that's a huge topic just to talk about there when we look at, the roots of Objective-C and far many, where we stand today, the fact that we owe pretty much every iPhone app to that original line. It's mind-blowing where we are.
We're incredibly lucky that it worked out that way.
Yeah. Because, but as an aside, obviously, before the iPhone really started to popularize the concept of mobile apps, can anyone say Java? Like,
Java 2ME.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So as another little aside, mobile apps, like, I don't know if you were a PDA guy or not.
I was. I had a few. I had two Palms.
Okay.
it was a handspring visor.
Mm-hmm.
Visor Pro,
Me too.
I had. And then I went to the Palm Tungsten T2.
Okay.
Yeah, which was a wonderful little device. This was after handspring sort of... there's a whole other story around it. And
yes.
I'm looking at... just a little spoiler for people. I am looking at maybe doing an episode about that. I'm trying to get hold of some early PDAs. But then I moved to... don't laugh too much. I moved to Windows Pocket PC. Windows
I had Pocket
Mobile.
PC. So the funny thing you mentioned that is because we had a very similar trajectory because I had a handspring visor Platinum. That was my first PDA. I got that. I want to say it was a birthday present. I was in high school. I must have been 16 or 17 years old. That was my birthday present for the year. And then I had that. I broke the digitizer. I fixed it. But then I upgraded to the Cassiopeia E125, the single greatest pocket PC that ever existed.
Yes.
And you know why it was the greatest. Number one, it had the best screen. Number two, it had a compact flash slot that you didn't need a freaking sled for like the compacts. And also the button arrangement, they put a cross button on the left side and 3 buttons on the right side. So you could play it like a Game Boy if you wanted to play games. It was the best one. It's like, I'm always buying these either pocket PCs or Minolta cameras or all sorts of other things that were, the sort of third rung at the time or however that you say. And that has that connection with Larry Tesler because he was really involved with the Newton. And, and those guys went off to go do their things, and the Palm came up as competition to that. You had the Scion and all this handheld computing stuff that took us like 10, 15 years to get to where the average person could use it as opposed to a nerd. And that was the same thing with the Mac, because one thing I like about old Macs is that they're all weird in their own ways. Even the ones that are kind of run of the mill, they all have their little idiosyncrasies. And, if I put down and say, okay, what can I think is my favorite, we all have our eras of Macs. We have our 68K era. We have our PowerPC pre-OS 10 era. Then there's the OS 10 the post-jobs OS 10 PowerPC era. And then there's Intel and everything else. And if you had to ask me, it's like, Dan, if you had to have one Mac of those eras, which would you pick? And I gotta say, as dumb as they are, and as bad as they are, I have a real soft spot for these all-in-one Performas.
Yes.
Now, there's more than one of them. There's the first all-in-one Performa, which is kind of like the outgrowth of the Color Classic. Those are the 500 series, the 520s, the 545s, 580s. They're the Hook code name. The Macintosh TV, which I own. That's a story I can tell later. And then those got replaced by machines that looked nicer but were materially worse, which are the Power Mac 5000 series, which were kind of like proto iMacs in sort of their all-in-one nature. Those machines I don't like very much, even though by the time they got to the 200, 300 megahertz powered PCs, they sort of worked out all the bugs. Those old 68K all-in-ones, that was a formative experience for me, because those were the Macs that we had in like the middle school lab. They had a CD-ROM drive, they had everything you needed and nothing you didn't. And they were not great Macs, and they were kind of ugly too, but I have a soft spot for them. Now, if you could only have one Mac of all time, it would have to be a PowerPC G4 Tower. That's the only one you could have if you could only have one of those PowerPC Macs.
So, you say that, but of course there are multiple variants of that G4. Now, it's worth probably mentioning at this point when we talk about the different eras. So, after Steve Jobs left, the Macintosh product line, would it be fair to say, became very overpopulated?
Well, it took a little bit until after. It's funny how you say that, because the overpopulation took several years to come about, and that really was with the Performas. Before the Performas, because that's when they really decide, okay, we want to expand our market share. How do we do that? We flood the retail channels. They were absolutely convinced if they just put a Mac, it didn't matter what Mac, just a Mac in front of people, surely the superiority of the Macintosh would convince people to just up and buy it with no problem. That wasn't really the case, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So you have that, Steve leaves in 1985. You have about 5 years where you have the Macintosh 2 era, you get into the early LC era, and then you get into the Performa, or what I like to call it the beleaguered era, because we're talking like 1993 into 1994, when things, Scully leaves, we've got Spindler, everything starts going sideways. And then Gil Amelio comes in, and that's when we start getting into the faster power PCs, the G3s and things like that. Steve comes back. By then, absolutely, Apple was rudderless. For a company that was inventing so many great ideas. QuickTime. We owe the entirety of online video as we know it to QuickTime, and not just QuickTime. You had people producing all these really interesting technologies that would end up being useful for the most part. OpenDoc is OpenDoc. I don't think anybody has ever been able to make a compelling case as to why a normal person would want to do that. But so suffice to say that, Apple, by that time, they really had lost their way, and there was so many things that they just didn't know what you were doing. And then we had the clones, the clone era, which people look back fondly. I know you guys had the Mac clones over in the UK as well. I know you guys had probably more like the UMax clones. I think
we would have had more of a UMax from a power computing.
Yeah.
And again, just to clue people, and these are where Apple said, okay, anyone with a license can make Mac hardware and can, which a lot of people now would love to do, run Mac. Well, okay,
they try.
Macintosh community, they try.
Yeah.
Okay, let's not we could get a whole into that area, but they could run licensed copies of certain versions of macOS. I think the license was good. Was it good up until macOS 8, I think?
Yeah, and originally they were going to clamp it before that, but what wound up happening was, after a lot of people got really mad, Apple wound up buying Power Computing, and they wound up being a little more lenient on where that would fall down. I mean, I own a clone. I have a Power Computing clone that's over on the other side of the room with a matching monitor.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Apple were not the first. This is, if I've got this wrong, please do correct me.
Sure.
Power Computing released the first multiprocessor Mac, not Apple.
I actually think it was Daystar that
it might
did it
be
first,
Daystar
because it was.
It is Daystar, so it is the Daystar MP. Sorry, my apologies.
Nope,
yes,
that's okay. And that's funny. That's a great segue into into the Mac's real big community and why Daystar released that dual processor Mac clone and eventually did upgrade cards for other Macs, and Apple licensed that technology from Daystar as well. They did that because the Mac, what kept Apple alive during all those beleaguered years, aside from, whatever they could scrape out from their retail sales, was the desktop publishing and electronic prepress community. They were the ones that kept Apple in business and were probably most of the really obnoxious people that were coming to knocking on your door and said, "Have you heard about the joy of Macintosh today?"
I would love if that's a thing. Instead of Jehovah's Witnesses coming around, you've got Mac users.
It certainly felt that way. I fully admit to be, I consider myself a technology enthusiast. I'm not I can certainly get a little fanish sometimes. And we all get a little fanish sometimes. But I consider myself first an enthusiast of technology, whether it's, classic PCs, modern Macs, vintage Macs, all the retro stuff and things that I missed out on when I was a kid, like Amigas and STs. It's like, I'd love to have an Amiga or ST in my house of my own. It's just, to me, just that stuff is just all so neat. But there's just something, and I know, especially with the Amiga and especially with the ST, I have a feeling that even though you see people ragging all the time saying, "Oh, the fastest way to own a Mac is to buy an Amiga and run Shapeshift," and I'm like, well, there's more to it than that. It's one of those things where Obi-Wan would say it's true from a certain point of view, and I have a feeling that for a lot of Mac and Amiga and ST users, they're a lot more alike than they are different. I think a lot of people would say that they have a lot of similar things that come into that. And so in the 90s, you had that certain kind of especially in the States, a really annoying Mac user who would say, "Oh, the Mac is the best at everything." And the hard thing is that for a lot of things, they were right. And that's why people didn't like them, because they were right. They weren't right on everything, but in a lot of ways, they were right until Windows 95 came around, plug and play came around, the PC slowly, and then Apple, of course, mismanaging everything else into the ground, gave them the opportunity to catch up. And so with that Daystar clone, the reason why it was so popular was because that machine would literally pay for itself. If you worked in electronic prepress or desktop publishing and you ran Photoshop all day long, because at that time, that was the only thing that could take advantage of the second processor. Was Photoshop, because Adobe had coded it and say, okay, we can do this with this and certain filters and processes that literally you could slash that time in half. If that took a flattening or a compositing time down from, say, 15 minutes to 7 minutes, you can get a lot more work done. And that's why, those things got so popular. And that's why, a lot of people I know who are from that community, as I was part of it as well, they loved those machines and they cried so hard when Apple came back. It turned out to be for the better for everybody, but it's an interesting community. You mentioned earlier that you said you had some kind of experience. Before I go off on my tangent, I'm curious. What's your sort of experience?
Well, that's a really good question. So desktop publishing, obviously when I started going into high school, desktop publishing was very established, and obviously on my Mac side, you had all the high-end QuarkXpress. But my first real experience with desktop publishing was, don't laugh, Microsoft Publisher.
I won't laugh. I mean, that's a lot of people's. Technically my first experience with desktop publishing was Spinnaker Newsroom. I think it was Spinnaker that did it. Newsroom on the Commodore 64, which even though it's, maybe even the print shop counts. I mean, I know you guys have print shop over there. That, I would say, from a certain point of view, that does count as desktop publishing, making your signs and greeting cards.
Banners,
Yeah. I mean, we're both, like I said, of a similar vintage. We know by the 90s, this stuff had completely taken over. You still had people doing things old ways, and there's still older ways of doing things that are still useful from an artistic point of view. But for the workaday publisher, I mean, things had just taken over completely. And I think people sort of underestimate, if you're not in that sort of environment, if you're not in DTP, if you're not in printing or pre-press or whatever, what happened with that was just a complete sea change of how things operated. It's like you could take a guy from the 70s and put him into the 90s, and he would go, my God, it would be a mind-blowing experience for them.
My father actually worked in the print industry, in the newspaper industry, but not on the pre-press side. Mm-hmm. My dad's a print engineer. He's a very good one. I'm very, very proud of my father's done a lot.
So did he run a press?
Yeah, he was. Okay. So we moved to where we lived before because my dad got a job as chief mechanical engineer designate. It's when back in the days when you'd actually start your job before the person you're taking over for left,
right?
And they would train you. But because of that connection, he got me in to do some not apprenticeship, like some work experience stuff in IT because I was interested in computers, and that was my first experience of pre-press Macs. So the rest of the business are all on, like Gateway 2000 PCs.
The front office.
But the front office is all on Gateway 2000s, and we had people breaking their cup holders, all of that sort of stuff. And the pre-press team and the journalists are all on Macs.
Yep.
And I remember seeing for the first time the blue and white G3s in an entire office. It was an incredible experience. I actually helped try and upgrade to, I think it was upgrade to a version of Mac OS 8 for, someone taught me how to do that on a G3 iMac. So that was my first experience. But we talk about sort of desktop publishing, and correct me if I'm wrong, so the traditional way is very much sort of manual layout on sheets, and then, it's literally cut and paste.
Yeah. So to give an idea, like in what I like to call the bad old days, you had multiple levels of how things work. So imagine in your mind, we're going back 70 years. We're thinking in terms of the 60s and the 70s. Okay. So you had multiple levels of how things work. You had guys in the very low end with their mimeographs or whatever. Xeroxes were just invented, that sort of stuff where you could do literal cut and paste. Well, you think about, what am I cutting and what am I pasting? How do I get from there to here? So you think, okay, well, if I want artwork, I have to go to the actual book of clip art and clip it out of the book, hence the name. And then if you want text, you either had to sit there with your typewriter and type up if you're really low budget operation, you sit there with a typewriter and, type it out and then into blocks and cut, as you say, cut and paste the blocks with wax onto a master sheet, which would then say, if you knew somebody with a Xerox machine, they could Xerox it for you. Or you knew somebody with a duplicator who could take it and photograph it, and then they would photograph it and it would get made into a low-end plate, because even in those old days, they could photographically make that sort of stuff. And even before that, we had letterpress. That's where you would actually take movable type in lead and cast it and make a plate based on, or even just take letterpress and press it directly into the paper, or cast a plate based on the movable type. There's a whole very fascinating, history of printing and everything else.
Yeah.
By the 70s, we had electronic photo typesetting. So what you could do is you had a linotype machine. It used to be linotype. You'd type on a linotype. It would take all the little metal bits of fonts and arranged the metal bits into blocks that would then get cast with everything else. By the time we had electronic photo typesetting, the linotype machines now, you sit in front of it and it would photographically expose each letter onto the row, and it would print out these like long strips of type that you would then cut up and paste up or everything else. And then this is where the Xerox connection comes back into place. The very early, I hate saying GUI, but those very early Xerox systems, like we're talking like early 70s here, those were designed primarily as advanced word processing machines that would have layout capabilities that we would look at it and see, okay, when he puts this document together, this is used by the U.S. government post office, this is for typesetting, you would recognize it very much as something similar to Microsoft Word today. And the reason why is the guys who invented that were the same guys who Microsoft hired to make Microsoft Word. So, that's just how it goes for you. Charles Simone is, and him and two other guys, I believe, from Xerox were largely responsible for that. So all of this comes together where it's a lot easier than it was with movable type, but it's still not accessible to the average everyday person. Like the normal person can't go and buy one of these machines and do it.
No.
Impossible. So then you have the Macintosh. It was three things that made the Macintosh, like it primed it for it. First was PostScript, which came from Warnock and Gursky at Adobe, who came from Xerox. Of course, they left Xerox to go make Adobe. You had the Apple Macintosh. Apple made the laser writer with a Canon engine and PostScript. They put that all together, and then Paul Brainerd, who founded Aldus, created PageMaker. And that is like the actual basis of, you can draw a straight line from there to what every graphic designer is doing today in InDesign, or if you are still a masochist, still using QuarkXpress. I have opinions about Quark. So all that, like, you can draw that straight line.
Just to be clear,
today.
we do mean the software Quark, not the Deep Space Nine character Quark.
It's funny you mention that, because even though Quark the company predates Quark the character, I mean, at least you can say that Quark the character had some kind of ethics and moral compass. I'm not sure you could say that about Fred Ibrahimi at Quark the company. Now, Tim Gill, he's a different story. He's the other guy who's responsible for Quark. He's, we'll talk about him later. But, the way Quark the company treated their customers sometimes, you have to wonder, would Quark the character actually treat you a little more fairly?
and this is a Ferengi, by the way. So for anyone who doesn't know, Ferengi have a reputation in Star Trek for being...
the rules of acquisition.
Yes.
It's like like I said, Quark... the Ferengi have the reputation of being, they like money, they're hyper capitalists. That's what they are, especially in Deep Space Nine, when they finally nailed what a Ferengi actually was versus the sort of stereotypes that they used for them kind of back in Next Generation. We actually got a little more of that in DS9, but at least, like I said, the character of Quark, he obeys those rules of acquisition, and to his detriment sometimes he leaves money on the table, There's different kinds of profit than money. I'll say that. And Quark the character demonstrated that several times. But enough about Star Trek.
Anyway, yes.
So we're getting here in desktop publishing, and the Mac was so instrumental in that happening, because even though PageMaker was available on other platforms, it came out on Windows eventually. I have actually a copy of old Windows PageMaker, like version 4.0 up here. I found a thrift store. The Windows version of PageMaker came out like a year and a half after the Macintosh one. But the Mac just provided this opportunity for that to happen. And, I always see people sort of coming out of the woodwork, and as an Amiga user, this is where I usually hear it from, is that, the Amiga could do this too, or, the ST could do it too. And I'm like, you're not wrong, but it's a case where the reason why it was the Macintosh was the screen. And, we're always riffing, especially me as a as a Commodore user. It's like, oh, but why would I care about a machine that can't do colors? Colors. It's like, that's what I want, is a color display and so on and so forth. And that's what Amiga users would say. And even though the ST had its high resolution monochrome display, I mean, generally people cared about those machines because they cared about color. But because the Mac had an actual fairly high resolution monochrome screen with actual bitmap graphics with no interlacing, and so people saying, well, my machines can do that, but it's just one of those cases where Commodore didn't have the company culture to be able to do that. Atari didn't either. They wouldn't have pushed that as much as Apple did. And even though Jobs was out the door largely by the time that happened, the stuff that he put in place, especially with the laser writer, made it all happen. And to think now, that stuff cost $1 bazillion back in the day. So we say, oh, a normal person can do it. We're thinking in scales of, with your Amigas and our Commodores, we say, okay, well, we're normal people. We can go and buy this computer, a Commodore 64 for $300-$400. I can go buy an Amiga, 1000 for $1,100-$1,200 and be able to do all this cool stuff with it that would have cost many thousands of dollars before. But a Macintosh with this stuff, let's say with a laser writer, you'd spend $10,000 out the door to do this stuff to replace machines that would have cost 10 times as much. It's insane just how much more accessible that is. It's like today these numbers sound made up. It doesn't make any sense. But for people who are like, I want to be able to do this in my house and not have to go to a shop. It was crazy. That's why I like so much about that era.
It's incredible, and as you said, we've got Aldus PageMaker, which I had definitely heard of. Again, I've not used these tools. Obviously, we were high resolution monochrome display, which is great for text, great for page layout. I mean, you can't do color graphics, but I'm guessing most people were still working with monochrome at that point, so it didn't really matter.
Well, so what happened is that the first versions of PostScript, which was really the basis upon how we were able to do all this in the first place, is PostScript. That's really the bedrock found. Without PostScript, it would have been a lot gnarlier, because you think about the old days of a printer. You have, say, your dot matrix printers or whatever. It's like, it's like, well, we can send characters and we can send bitmaps, but you have to think about everything for every specific printer in the world. I'm sure you remember, say, on the Commodore 64 or other things like that, saying, oh, I'm using my program, I have to pick the specific printer. And if I don't pick the specific printer when I print, everything's going to come out as garbage, Yeah. And that was true for a lot of computers back then. Well, PostScript made this device independent. So instead of saying, okay, I'm going to draw these pixels to these pixels, PostScript says, well, describe how you want to draw this in a computer language. And then on the printer, there is an interpreter that goes and interprets the language specifically for that device.
So that was all baked into a printer, so that, again, any program could write to PostScript. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong. PostScript, do we owe the origins of modern PDFs to PostScript as well?
Yes, we do, because PDF is basically PostScript. It is a very different, it's like a further advancement of PostScript. It's a containerized version of PostScript. But if you're used to thinking in the way of PostScript, then you can look at a PDF file and say, oh, yes, well, I recognize these recs here. I recognize these dictionaries and so on and so forth. They're not too dissimilar. What makes PDF is that it's a kind of displayable PostScript that you don't have to go and laboriously render to a high resolution print style device. I mean, you can do that's how modern raster image processors work. But we owe PDF. Without PostScript, there would be no PDF. That's basically it.
It's also worth saying that because that was built into a Macintosh, the system, and then Mac OS, it's why on a Mac, even to this day, you don't need a third-party PDF tool, because Macintosh is still has a lot of the PostScript technology still baked into it.
Well, see, that's where we get into the weeds, because on Mac OS X, what we know of as core graphics, which is really the display layer, is built on several technologies, one of which is PDF based, which is the Quartz image interpreter. And so the Quartz is what we would call, say, display PDF, as opposed to on the Next or certain workstations, we would have display PostScript. But the idea is the same. It's saying, okay, instead of thinking like in Windows terms, if in Windows they think of GDI, you use GDI to draw your primitives and so on and so forth. But on a Next, you think, well, we're going to write out PostScript code, and then the interpreter takes the display PostScript interpreter is what actually rasterizes it and draws it all on the screen. And on the Mac, even though Quartz is slightly different than how that worked, it's the fundamental idea is still the same. All of what you see on a Mac as graphics in Windows are all defined in a PDF context that then gets rendered to the composited, I should say, rendered and then composited to the display via the Windows server. So that's why as you say, on the Mac, you can just go and say, oh, I'm going to print a PDF of this, and it's just done, because that's how the system thinks. And we owe a lot of that to, I mean, the idea of doing that, in the 80s would have seemed insane, and it was with display PostScript because it was really slow. But we advance, that's how things go on.
So obviously, we talked about Aldus Page. Just so I understand, by the way,
sure.
I know Quark is still around because I looked it up earlier. Where do we stick? Is PageMaker still a product, or has that got bought?
So that's an interesting story. So QuarkXpress still exists. So the very short background history of this week, in 86, we got PageMaker from Aldus. I want to say it was late 87 or early 88 that we got Quark, the first version of QuarkXpress.
From a Wikipedia I read earlier, 87. So, yeah.
So I'm see, I still remember this stuff. And so Quark very quickly overtook PageMaker as far as like the actual workaday graphic designer's tool. And the reason why Quark took over was it had this sort of frame methodology of thinking of things, and its mathematics was extremely precise. Like, you could position something in Quark to like tenths, hundredths, thousandths of a point, which when you think of a point is 1/72 of an inch, and then you get to even further fractions of that, and Quark would consistently put it in that same place every time. And Quark was extremely extensible. I mean, we look at its UI now, you look at that old UI and say, how the heck did we ever do anything with this? But hidden in there was this kind of crazy logic that once you learned it, you see a person who knows those Quark key commands, just like somebody who knows the Photoshop key commands. They just go completely insane with it. And so Quark basically put PageMaker down to a lower end product. So what happened was Adobe buys Aldus, not just for PageMaker, but for other products that Aldus is doing at the time. And the people who were doing PageMaker are like, well, PageMaker we can't make that into a real Quark competitor. So they decide to start a new project, which is codenamed K2. And if they started, I want to say like maybe 94 is when it starts. And we see the first version of it come out in 1999, I think, as the first version of Adobe InDesign. So you can say that even though InDesign is not PageMaker, a lot of the people who worked on K2 were people who were working on PageMaker back in the day and moved on.
It has some DNA of PageMaker from the team who built it.
It is very much, especially those early versions are especially an Aldus style product that said, well, we're Aldus. We want to take a bunch of stuff from the Adobe cookie jar. And that's what they did in order to make InDesign do what it did. And, we had the big battle between them and Quark. Fred Ibrahimi famously telling people to say, well, if you don't like that, Quark 5 doesn't run on Mac OS X, switch to something else. And then people did.
Yeah. And, InDesign is still used, it's
the number one product.
It's the number one. And it's interesting, but, we owe so much of, the accessibility to do, so Photoshop, I have a feeling started on my Mac.
It did.
As well.
It did. So I believe I'm pulling back my Photoshop history memory here. So Photoshop started as a project of the Knoll brothers, who are, Thomas Knoll and John Knoll, who at the time were working for Industrial Light and Matt. They were working with Lucasfilm. they were John Knoll especially was a long time, visual effects for that. And that's where they got their start with that. And Photoshop started as their way of manipulating digital images to do those things. And then it grew up from there, eventually got ported to Windows. Nowadays everybody thinks of Adobe as the Photoshop company, and rightfully so, because a lot of people use Photoshop for a lot of things. But that wasn't how Adobe built their fortune. They built their fortune off of PostScript, both for licensing PostScript Type 1 fonts, which was their real moneymaker. That was the thing that, that's a whole other story in itself. And then Illustrator, which is Adobe's oldest, really consumer-facing product, which Illustrator is basically just a graphical editor of PostScript and now PDF. That's really what Illustrator is. And so we have these toolkits, these disparate things that let people do stuff that would be otherwise really either expensive from a time standpoint or a money standpoint or just from a practicality standpoint. Because, think before Photoshop. We used to have raster image editors before Photoshop, but you needed dedicated machines to do it. There was Deluxe Paint on the Amiga, but Deluxe Paint was a different, even though it was also a raster editor, it was a slightly different kind of product than Photoshop, even though it became more Photoshop-like as time went on. We had those kind of things, but Deep Paint wasn't hard to use. I've used Deep Paint. It's easy to use. But to do certain things like image layering, that was a real, Photoshop brought that to people who had never done that before. It's just mind-blowing what we can do. And now, of course, you don't, it used to be if you wanted to be serious about that, you'd do that on a Mac. And that's why your pre-press department was all Macs, Nowadays, you can do it on a PC. Granted, I do all my photo editing, my Illustrator stuff in InDesign. Anything I do that I do on a Windows machine. You couldn't do that 25 years ago for a variety of reasons. A lot of people still work primarily on a Mac today for a lot of other reasons. And that's, I think that's the real legacy of that stuff, is just that without that desktop publishing market, without electronic prepress, Apple would have died. They were that was the reason they were around,
And it's fascinating, now we see newer companies coming along and challenging Adobe's. Mm-hmm. I say challenging, but I think they're doing a great job of it. I am a huge fan of their products, and I'm talking about Affinity.
Yes,
by Serif.
Serif, absolutely. I love Serif. They're good guys. So, we've gone an hour into this. I haven't even given my background and why I know so much about this crap.
Yeah, please do tell it. Yeah,
so,
please do.
The first time I saw actual live Photoshop, I want to say it was 1997. I saw it running on a Mac, and I'm like, okay, I want to do that. I want to be in computer graphics. That's what I want to do, because I was already a computer, and it's well, I like art, I like computers. Can't I just make the Reese's peanut butter cup? I'll just smush them all together. I'm yeah, I can do that. So that's what got me into taking an art career more seriously. I got into traditional graphic design. At school, I learned the practicalities of how that stuff was made. I know how to run a press. We had a graphic design program with graphic arts. We knew how to run presses. We knew how the bindery worked, because you're making a physical thing. You can design something on a computer that is completely unprintable. You can have, the computer will let you hang yourself all day long if you don't know those intricacies. And so that's how I got that background. And I actually I was in the business for 20 something years. I was a 17-year-old kid. I was working at a local print shop as their in-house graphic designer, which was pretty fun. I went off to college to get my art degree, get my bachelor's in art. I worked at as another in-shop designer for a while. And then in 2007, I was hired by a company that I guarantee nobody here listening will know. It was a company named Rampage. And Rampage was a raster image workflow manufacturer. They don't exist anymore. I know you just had Paul and the guys from Pixel Addict and Amiga Addict on the other week. When they go to print that magazine, they can take their InDesign files and bundle it all up, or they can take a PDF and give it to the printer. that PDF has to go on the press somehow. How do they get it on the press? Whether it's a digital press or the old school style press, all those pages have to be rendered and rasterized. And so you have these systems designed purely around high-speed rendering of PDFs and PostScript that then lay them out on the big flats, which then get made into plates, and then the plates go and get put on the press. So that's what we did at Rampage. We took those PDF files and PostScript files and rasterized them and made a workflow around them because you could sit there and render each one. And the idea is to, replace the old jobs, because I'm sure as your dad worked in a print shop and you knew those old electronic prepress in the olden days before direct to plate, you made film. And then you took the film and you stripped them up into the flats. The guy who the only job their job was to tape them up on the flats, cut out the stuff, and expose them onto the plates. Then that was replaced by direct to plate. That's what these systems were done. And our system was powered by Harlequin, which is by Global Graphics, which is Cambridge based. So there's the UK connect. I mean, we actually have a Global Graphics office out here near where I am in Waltham. I believe they're still out there, last I checked. But basically that's my background is I worked in QA for this product. So our job was to make sure that people don't screw up when they're doing it. And if something does screw up and our field techs can't figure it out or whatever, they'd break glass and call us on the telephone and say, hey, we need you to put this in front of the developer or whatever. And, say, okay, one of the many things that we did. So, that's like my experience. It's just like, as a working designer and as the person who worked on the products that actually made those into the stuff that the press people would use, I've seen kind of both sides of that coin and just how computer technology has really advanced that. It's really quite interesting.
It really is. And, it's funny you mentioned, because it wasn't a print shop that my dad worked at. It was a newspaper.
Oh, yes.
So this is huge. And if I say the name Goss.
Yes, I know Goss. Yep, I know Goss.
Well, that's where my dad started his career. But it's interesting because, I remember I worked there. I worked in inserting. So basically, for those who don't know what inserting is, putting one newspaper inside of another when the machinery failed. And it failed a lot.
Yes.
Walking through the plate making department to get to our department, you could smell the film fumes. And it's just fascinating seeing how far we've come. As you said, we've now got direct to plate, but it's still all based on a PDF. Now, you mentioned one thing, which I think a lot of people in this digital age won't think of.
Okay.
Because, I can design something in Affinity Designer or Affinity Publisher, because that's their InDesign alternative. But I could design something, but if I don't know, bleeds and the crop marks and the right, safe areas and things like that,
maximum ink density.
Exactly. I'm not going, and I hand that off to a printer, to be printed for leaflets, for example. I'm going to get laughed at. Well,
you're not necessarily going to get laughed. So one of the things that I did at Rampage was that I was in charge of our pre-flighting product that we had inside the workflow. So take a newspaper, for instance. So when they're putting the newspaper together, they have ads, for example. They have to put the ads, PDF files or whatever, ads all over the newspaper. They get those ads from who knows where. And those files could have all kinds of problems. So what happens is those files get scanned ahead of time to say, hey, we noticed these potential problems. These are what these problems could be. And then the prepress operator says, well, we don't care. Or, well, yes, I need to kick this back to the customer. So in your case, let's say if you didn't have any, you say, well, I'm making a business card. In the United States, our business cards are 3 inches wide by 2.5 tall. Okay. I think in the UK, there's something like, I used to have this memorized. It's amazing how I've forgotten it, in certain millimeters or whatever. But so what happens is, oh, well, wait a minute. You don't have your 3 millimeters of bleed around. I still remember that exact number though. You don't have your 3 millimeters of bleed around your thing. They're going to flag it and they're going to come back to you and said, hey, we can't print this like this. Either you can pay us to fix it or we can kick it back to you and you can fix it, and then so on and so forth. So that's another thing where computers really come into play, is to say, I as a designer who are saying, okay, I'm putting these things together. I've designed this fancy book, and I've sent this off, and generally a trained designer will know what they can and can't do. But even then, there's things that you don't foresee that could potentially be an issue. And that's one of the things that we do is say, hey, step back a minute. What could these potential problems be? Because when you make those plates and you get something on press, make ready is expensive. Plates are expensive. Time is expensive. You make mistakes, you are costing, like that company loses money every time there's a mistake. So that's what, because rasterization and stuff, even though it gets better, is kind of, I don't want to say it's a solved problem, but it's something where it's not glamorous. It's not something where if you're trying to sell it to somebody, they can say, well, we're not going to give you another $10,000 for your product this year because you didn't put in something that would save us X amount of dollars or whatever. That's what these people are buying, and that's where the market is really going these days. I mean, are you familiar at all with like how things are on the digital side of things, like digital print production?
I have to admit, I'm not. It's not an area of the industry I've had any experience with.
That's okay, but it's one way that people are making their margins these days. Because when Rampage went out of business, we were acquired, I should say, by Fujifilm. And Fujifilm, they have I have colleagues in the UK, former colleagues who worked at Fujifilm UK. And we had our own workflow product. But one thing with that workflow product is that we had a digital press. And the idea is that with digital press, you don't need plates. You print from the press directly to the paper. In most cases, most digital presses, they're just fancy Xerox machines. Most of them are. But then you get to more interesting things like the HP Indigo, which is something which is not a toner base. It's a liquid dot based type thing. And then at Fujifilm, we had a product called the J Press, or in Europe, I believe they call it the Jet Press. You can't call it that in the United States, I guess. So the idea behind the J Press is, everybody knows Epson printers, right? Or Canon bubble jet printers, or our standard inkjet printer. You probably have one in your house right now. When those printers print, your print head goes zoop, zoop, zoop. It just goes horizontally across the platen and lays down the ink in these raster lines. So you say, okay, well, I'm used to that. Now think of it this way. Instead of having a head that moves across the sheet, instead you say, what if we made a head that is as wide as the sheet? Or more accurately, multiple heads placed in a row to take up the width of the sheet. Like, those are the kinds of solutions to these problems. And so when the paper goes through the press, it's literally shooting ink the entire width of the paper. Wow. And it can print a whole sheet of paper, full color, with a coating. And I think we were doing like several thousand per hour. Like, I think before you could get a J Press that would do like 3,600 sheets per hour. And this is for something where you put it next to an offset. You're like, well, I'm seeing double. I can tell the difference because I can. That's the kind of technology that people are going to these days because it's faster, it's cheaper, and the quality can actually be really good.
Just to put that into context, when you talk about, most inkjets these days, a couple of pages a minute, if that.
Yeah, we're just talking like color lasers will do stuff like, they'll do 10, 15 pages a minute or whatever on color lasers. Or you have your high quality inkjet printer. If you're doing a photo printer, that takes like a minute per page. Or if you're just talking like A4 size sheets or 8.5 by 11 sheets, on the J Press, we're talking something that is 36 inches wide by 24 inches tall. That is it's a really large sheet. It's like a 4-up, do 4 8-up type things. So all of this, we've gotten very far afield from, vintage Macs and DTP, but all that stuff came from that place, like without the Mac and without the PostScript, because it's still, at the end of the day, it's still, you can think of that J Press as like a giant Mac, even though it's running on a PC, a giant laser writer, even though it's an inkjet, and PDF behind the screens, which is really PostScript. It's just on a completely wildly different scale. It's like, I don't really see how anything else could have gone that way. Now, I will put myself aside from talking about all this, print industry who's-y, what's-its, and doodads, and just say, I remember, I think before the show, you were talking about a Power Mac 8600, I think. Were you not?
The iMac G4 was the one I mentioned, but I'm Power Mac. No, my friend had a Performer.
Oh, the Performer.
So he had a Performer. Now it wasn't one of the all-in-ones. It was a
tower.
No, it was a pizza box. Like
a desk. Okay, I know exactly
desktop.
the one you're talking about. It's probably like what we would call a Performa. Like it would before it'd be the 600 series, and then it became if it was a Power PC, it was a 6000.
It was a 68K machine.
Okay, so it would have been a 600 series.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And he had the TV tuner / AV card in it.
I have one of those in the box right here.
And I remember we were doing some stuff for our youth group, and he brought it all round, brought everything round, and we captured maybe 2 or 3. I think we made 10 seconds of clip from The Matrix to use for something, and it took us all day to render the thing out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we love about this stuff. Like that's sort of like how we're doing on our my first Photoshop projects that when I was cutting my teeth on Photoshop on these beige Macs. Like we're talking Power Mac, 200 megahertz Power Macs, and then eventually this is like 96, 97. So we're talking 200 megahertz Power Macs here. Like Photoshop 3.0 with only one level of undo.
Wow.
Yeah. I was learning how to digitally color comics because that's something I still do to this day is digitally coloring and lettering comics. That's something that in the bad old days was really hard. You had to cut out these color separation bits and do all this really tedious and awful work. Now it's just the computer. It's much easier, much faster, much more powerful. It's like good riddance to bad garbage as far as the old stuff goes. But that was how I learned Photoshop was all that. And I think that's a common story for a lot of people out there. That's how they learned Photoshop is they had some kind of project that gave them some kind of passion. And in a lot of cases, it could have been on these old Macs, as it were, that kind of brought them to it. As creaky as they were.
Yeah, because, I think a lot of people discount, those Macs as, that's before Jobs came back, they aren't cool. When we started to get, the G3 iMac, because I might be wrong on this, and if I am, but the blue and white G3 was not the first G3 Mac.
Correct.
There was a beige there. Actually, there was even an all-in-one G3.
It's what I like to call the tooth. Other people call it the molar, but I just say, well, I think it might be really more of a bicuspid shape. I don't know. I'm not a dentist.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway. But yeah, there were beige G3s, and that's why I used a beige G3 for quite a bit during my high school career as learning Photoshop and PageMaker and Illustrator, and those machines. I can say a lot about those machines that I don't like very much, and as the age has gone by, and it's funny how. I think that's true with all these retro things. We've had some years beyond them where, remember back then that was before Mac OS 10. That was that was System 7, Mac OS 8, where you're sitting there constantly mashing Command S because God knows, you could have some crash and it would take the whole thing down because there was no preemptive multitasking, no protected memory, none of that.
When did that was that Mac OS 10? It was preemptive.
It was Mac OS. They kind of hacked in a couple things to do certain things in Mac OS 8 and Mac OS 9, but it was not true. It really took Mac OS 10, which was Next based, to just say we're a clean break. We've got all these actual modern computing features now, which is it's amazing when you think about it. Mac OS 10 outliving the classic Mac OS, it's been that way for longer. That's one way to make it feel old.
In my first experience with Mac OS, actually daily driving Mac OS was Tiger, 10.4 Tiger.
That's a good time to get into it too, because by then most of the tough points had been kind of smoothed out. The first Mac that I actually owned was a Titanium PowerBook. And it was all the other Macs in my life were I either used them at work or I used them at school. We had PCs at home. But I said, well, if I'm going to buy a laptop, I'm going to buy a Mac. And I 667 megahertz with the DVI port that I think cost $2,800 at that time. That was a lot of working hours.
So the tie book, isn't that the one that had like the problem with the coating coming off and?
Yep, I've got one in the other room over there. I mean, hinges breaking. I mean,
yeah.
The thing is, like, it's a very beautiful machine, but it's also a very fragile machine. And there were a lot of machines back then that were very much like that. The tie book, it's like I remember on mine, the hinge. I remember one day I opened it up, snap, busted the hinge. I remember mailing it away to some place to put a new hinge. This is before Apple Care would even touch it. They replaced the hinge for like $150, which isn't terrible, but it's like you're without your computer for a week. I mean, I still had my Windows machine, so I mean, I wasn't completely computerless, but still. And that just seemed like a common thing for us because especially back then, like those beige Macs, especially if we're thinking in the early PowerPC era, I mean, the hardware was that's why people were buying clones because the hardware was really expensive. It wasn't, I mean, it was reliable enough, but, Apple's engineering was kind of overwrought and, what's the way, I mean, I don't know the right phrase for it, but it's a case where you make something that's too complicated for its own good. Well, I would say like a German car.
Over-engineered, maybe?
Yeah, kind of over-engineered in some places, and yet under-engineered in other places. And that Performa that your friends has was of that sort of era. I mean, I have a soft spot for those machines now, and I think the only reason I have a soft spot, and I think you would probably say the same thing for your other vintage and retro machines as well, is that we're not living with them every day anymore. With a Mac, we're not dealing with those extension conflicts. We're not dealing with memory fragmentation anymore. We're not trying to free up as much RAM as we can for Quark to manually assign it so we can open up a certain document. We're not constantly command S-ing. We're not sitting there going, I'm running this Photoshop filter. I'm going to go up and get something to drink because it's a modal and it's taken over my entire system. I can't do anything else. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Now we can, it's kind of like, I'm not sure how familiar you are with like horse racing or anything else like that. But the analogy I like to think of is, before we had cars, even with all the societal ills and everything we have with cars, we were running horses into the ground. And now that we have cars, horses aren't so much beasts of burden anymore. Horses are great at a lot of things. But now we can have cars that do the things that we used to do with horses a lot better. And now we say, okay, well, if I want to enjoy horse, I can just go to, the pony rides I can go to Saratoga and watch the horses run around the track. I think that's the best way. I mean, I like thinking of them that way. It's like we can use them for nicer things. We can enjoy them more for what they are instead of what we were trying to force them to be back in the day.
We can have fun with them, like, Sean from Action Retro creating a RAID array out of 30 floppy disks on a vintage Mac. Like, oh, come on. Really?
I mean, Sean, he's a wild and crazy guy. And some of the stuff that he pulls is simply amazing. And so I remember earlier in the episode that I own a Macintosh TV. Now, a Macintosh TV, for those that are not familiar, is one of those all-in-one Performa LC hook style chassis, except it's all Darth Vader black.
Yes.
And the idea behind the Macintosh TV was that they're saying, we could sell these to like college students who say, well, we could have a computer and a TV. That'll get them to buy Macs this time. I mean, this is the kind of harebrained stuff that you're dealing with Apple of the 90s. They only made like 10,000 of them or whatever. And so one day I was just sitting around the house and I got a thing from Craigslist. I have notifications for local stuff that comes up and says, hey, somebody's selling something. And it came up with this guy who's selling a Macintosh TV for $80. And he says, now it doesn't boot. I'm like, that's fine. But I happened to see it. It's like, I got the email. It's like, I immediately I didn't care if it didn't boot. It's like, that can be fixed. It's about $80. I'm like, okay, we can talk. So I sent the guy an email and said, hey, can I come get it? He's like, sure. He lived a couple towns over, so it was a 20-minute drive down to his place. And this guy, he had it right there with the keyboard and the mouse and the remote control, so it's like the whole kit. And it's true, it would not start. I'm like, that's okay, I can deal with that. He had other interesting, he had a couple 128Ks of in various states of disrepair. He had a Macintosh portable that didn't start. I know somebody else had picked that up. He had in his back room, he had just a series of like Macintosh 2 cases and 2 CX cases that were gutted. They were empty. He used them as storage boxes. I mean, this guy he was a really interesting character. And I told him, I was like, you should go on a podcast and tell your story sometime. The very short version of his story is that for a long time, he worked with underprivileged children and other stuff to bring they refurbished like the old all-in-one Macs and brought them to foreign countries for computer literacy. And so he did this stuff he did it in Africa. He did it in all these countries where they were just taking and refurbishing these old Macs and putting, kid pics and everything else on them so that these children could experience computers, because this was in the 90s, like early 90s. It was extraordinarily difficult back then. This was very much a sort of, I won't speak for the guy. He didn't give me the sort of, I don't want to say the word mission from God, but it's just one of those things where it's like, it's somebody who has a deeply held belief about technology and what technology can do for somebody. I thought that was a very touching, I said, hey man, you should go on a podcast or something and tell this story, because it was a really interesting story. So I got the Mac TV from him, and of course I brought it home, didn't boot. I knew it got power, but it needed caps and other stuff. But because there's only so many of these boards and my restoration skills are mediocre at best, I packaged it up, and the logic board and stuff are currently in the hands of Steve, Mac 84.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so he will be doing a restoration on that. I'm paying him to do a restoration on that board sometime in the future. So hopefully I can get that machine back up and running. I know it gets power. I know the analog board stuff is still good. It was the logic board, but it's like, and with the way that machine is, there's so few of them. It's like, I don't want to screw this up. I'm like, luckily I have a good relationship with an expert. So I called the expert. He said, sure, send it on over. So hopefully that Macintosh TV will come back to life someday. I mean,
so it's interesting you mention, Steve from Mac 84, and I talked obviously about Sean from Action Retro, and of course we've had Ken.
Yep, Crazy Ken.
Heat Clan. Great guy, and he's just, as I speak, just released a video on a prototype. I think it's one of the...
It was a Quadra. I want to say it was probably... he's actually... I've been busy the past... My YouTube has been piling up on me because I've been busy with work and some other things over the past couple of days. And usually Saturday is I'm going to sit down and watch YouTube day. But it's more important that I, guest on your show. And YouTube will be there when I'm done. So it's on my list. But I think it was probably like a Quadra 700 or something of that vein.
I think it's Jurassic Park Max of what would have been featured. I just loved... Anyway, but that brings me on to something. There are so many of these classic Macs, and I don't mean Mac classic necessarily, but I'm vintage Macs. So for me, I think we said this earlier, this is anything pre-Intel for me.
Sure.
Is what I would... Then again, even some of the early Intel machines are pieces in their own right.
Yes.
Like those white polycarbonate MacBooks.
Yes. Those machines, I mean, I owned one of those, and because that is what replaced my titanium PowerBook. And I mean, in terms of the performance and the specs in that package, it was a really good package. But man, I can understand why they went away from those polycarbonate casings, because that was the only machine that, not just easy to damage, but like they just came apart. They crumbled. And so I had a top case repair. I've had that machine had a lot of things that it was not savable, unfortunately. So it wound up going to the great, I had somebody I gave it to that they could rip parts and stuff out of it. But I mean, there's definitely collectible stuff with that. But I'm also with you that to me, anything that is, pre-Intel is definitely more collectible in a sense.
And that brings it. So obviously we've talked about the legacy of a Mac in terms of its desktop publishing pedigree. But if someone's wanting to collect vintage Macs, what are things that they should be looking out for? Where can we get started, and maybe things to avoid? I mean, you talked about Macintosh Portable. That thing does not get enough of a look in at times because
it's a complicated machine.
A complicated machine. This is before those. For one thing, I'll say for Apple, if I ever had the opportunity to own an original PowerBook,
I mean, dude, I've got three of them here in the house. I'd be happy to give you one. Unfortunately, if you ever make your way to the States, or I keep saying that, I'm going to go to the UK. I mean, I've been to Ireland. Because I have a family connection in Ireland, but I've not yet been to anywhere in the actual, United Kingdom, whether it's Scotland or England. But I'd like to go to London. I'd like to go and explore the grand British countryside, as so many people.
You've got to go to the cave.
I've got to go yeah. Well, I also would want to go to that, I believe, because you've got the Center for Computing History.
Yes. Bletchley Park. Yes. Yeah.
Yep. I would love to see that, because that would have so much stuff there that, like, for here would be impossible for me to see. It's like I could spend 2 weeks in England just doing so. Okay, what's all my retro and vintage stuff I can do when I'm out there? But
see, Neil's missing a trick here. We could do package holidays for retro nerds.
Well, have a Christmas time. Have a Christmas time celebration. Christmas at the cave with, people donate vintage stuff, and you do in the States we would call it a Yankee swap. I don't know what they would call it in the UK.
We have that, yeah. I guess we call it like
we have Secret Santa, but Yankee swap is kind of a different thing. But yeah, sort of like, pass, share the wealth sort of thing. Because I've got these PowerBooks now. I got 3 of them. Of the 3 of them, one of them actually works pretty well. One of them, I think, needs kind of some screen work done on it, but boots otherwise. But yeah, so if you're Macintosh Portable is not where I would recommend somebody getting into vintage Mac collecting, because the Macintosh Portable, that machine is I don't want to say slapped together, but it is definitely a machine that was engineered in a very difficult way. And it's like, if you don't know the gotchas going into it, you're either going to destroy the machine or you're going to be very unhappy. There's easier ways to get into it. Like, the easiest way I think right now is honestly to get into that sort of late 90s Power PC era. They're not that hard to get into because they made a bajillion of them. I'm sure you can look up on Craigslist or Gumtree or Facebook Marketplace or any sorts of things you can find. Say, oh, I've got an old iMac that I want to get rid of. That's not a bad jumping in point, because iMacs have networking. They have USB. They're very easy to hook peripherals and things up to. And they will run, classic games, because what a lot of people do is they want to run, classic games or whatever. You can run a vast majority of really good stuff on that vintage of machine, where if you say, okay, well, I want something more of the ADB era, you have to think, well, do I want something that's 68K or do I want something that's PowerPC? And in my mind, it's worthwhile to have an actual 68K machine and an actual PowerPC machine, whether it's a newer vintage PowerPC machine or something more of the earlier thing. The nicer thing about the mid-range PowerPCs is that they have PCI cards, so there's a lot more card and add-in availability. What you run into is SCSI hard drives, because they're all dying. And luckily today, it's actually a lot nicer now than it was a few years ago if you were involved in this, because it used to be, it was SCSI 2SD or, that's all you had. Nowadays we have blue SCSI. There's raw SCSI. That's something you're really going to have to think about when you get into this, because with the modern ones, they have USB, they have optical media. It's not that hard to, even with Ethernet, it's not that hard to get stuff onto them, relatively speaking. Yeah. With the older machines, you have to think about it a little more. You say, okay, a lot of them have CD-ROM drives. That's not too bad. Floppies, you have to think about, okay, is it a super drive or is it 800K? 800K gets even more complicated. SCSI hard drives, you have to deal with that. If you want a good entry point, like as something that's not too expensive on the 68K side is you need to look at something that's undervalued. So like people say, oh, a 2FX is great. Yeah, 2FX is great if you can find one that isn't destroyed in some way or that, somebody's willing to part with for a reasonable price. The little black and white all-in-one Macs, they're actually fairly affordable. You can pick them up. They're not too bad to pick up. They're not that hard to fix, relatively speaking. The downside is that you say, okay, well, I want to think about a Mac Plus or an SE or a Classic. You look at those and say, well, you're dealing with 800K floppies. Unless you're lucky enough to have an SE that has an upgraded ROM with a super drive in it. Those are the things that you start thinking about. But really, they all have SCSI ports. You can blue SCSI, raw SCSI, all that stuff. That's what you really have to think about. And that's actually what makes those black and white Macs easy to do. Because if you have basic restoration skills, and assuming that the tube is good and stuff, all it takes is just a blue SCSI, raw SCSI with an image, and those machines are pretty much up and going. There's not that much to them. Now, they're not color. They're maybe limited on what they have for RAM, but I think they're neat. They're nice conversation pieces that are nice to have in the house.
They look good.
They look good. Yeah. But you start looking at color stuff, and that's where your Performa starts, being something that's interesting. The color stuff you run into, okay, Apple used their proprietary monitor connectors. So you got to think, okay, can I use it with a VGA monitor? The answer is usually yes. You can get adapters to use VGA monitors. For the most part, it's not that hard. You set the dip switches, you plug it in, and for the most part, it does the job. Or you can, if you find one, you can get a clone that actually has a VGA port and PS2 ports and other stuff. There's tons of ADB stuff out there still. And most of the time, people who are unloading these things, they usually have some form of peripherals. I think you just need to think about, usually if you're getting into those classic Macs, it's probably because you used to use one in the past. If you haven't used one of those Macs in the past, I would really do some homework first. Actually, the nice thing is there's lots of contemporary books out there. There's a website, Vintage Apple. And if you go to Vintage Apple, they have scans not only of manuals, but of like contemporary help books, like the Macintosh Bible. Like you had these classic Macworld guys who wrote, these books that were this thick. You say, oh, I'm looking at a System 7 error. How do I even use System 7? What's an extension? What's control panel? Like what's the basic stuff on how to use the OS? And if you because that's what I did as a kid, you go to the library. I'm not sure if you did this. We go to the library, they have a computer section with all these books. I'm like, I'm going to go and get these computer books. I'm just going to read these help books about operating systems because I'm that much of a freaking nerd. But, in other cases, it's just, hey, you find somebody unloading a machine, you get the machine, and if it boots, hey, at least that's something. And if you know somebody who can help you restore it or even learn how to restore it yourself, it's not that hard to get into. But my recommended entry point for most people is that early Jobs era, that late 90s, early aughts. A blue and white G3 Tower is like a perfect machine. It'll play lots of classic games, has VGA ports, has USB, has an ADB port, so you can still use ADB peripherals, has PCI cards, has, IDE hard drives and optical drives. You can put an internal zip drive in it. You can put a SCSI card into it. They're very easy machines to modify and have. And, the batteries too, they're just those little half AA batteries that you can buy on Amazon you get a 3-pack for $10 or whatever.
And of course, with IDE hard drives comes the ability to get adapters to run modern. You can do modern. I think you can do SATA to IDE adapters, but will then take a modern SSD. Now, I think you have to be very careful with those because not all of them work. But at the same time, you step up into if you find someone throwing out. Now, here's a question, of course, because I was about to say G5. If you can find a G5 going. Great machine, beautiful machines, and they had SATA. But there is a point, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know exactly where this is, but there's a point at which higher level PowerPC machines stopped being able to run macOS Classic.
That is correct. no G5 will natively boot into OS 9. Okay. The last machine that would boot OS 9 was a 1.25 gigahertz dual, we call it the press room special, because Apple kept this machine around for the pre-press people who needed OS 9. And OS 9 hung on for a long time because of Mac OS 10 adoption. Took a long time because of utilities, all the stuff that, to drag people kicking and screaming into a modern computer.
Didn't you mention earlier there was a whole thing with Quark not running for a long time, not running on OS 10? Yeah,
that was the case because Quark 5.0 came out right when 10.1 was coming out, and InDesign 2.0 had come out, which was Carbon native, came out in a very similar time frame. And
right.
Quark 5.0 came out, and people were sort of promised, oh yes, we'll release a Carbon update for 5.0. That never happened. You had to buy Quark 6, and that was another $800, and people were very unhappy about that. Yeah. So if you want to still boot into OS 9, you want one of the mirrored drive doors G4s. Now, there is one mirrored drive door G4 that will not boot into OS 9. It is the one that has FireWire 800 ports.
Yes.
Now, it can be hacked, and you can, in fact, hack newer G4s to run OS 9. Like, there's Mac Minis that are G4s that you can hack to run OS 9. But if you want officially Apple supported, it's the dual 1.25 gigahertz with FireWire 400, because that one was actually a holdover. The FireWire 800 one replaced it. The FireWire 800 one was replaced by the G5. The old one hung around as that special for another year. I mean, I like G5s. I mean, I think they look neat, but the reality is that to run a G5, you're running PowerPC Mac OS 10 up to 10.5.
Yeah.
They're neat machines, but it's one of those things like, okay, well, what are you planning on doing with it exactly? Because you can run those games of that era most of the time, either on PCs, or you can run them in Rosetta on an Intel Mac and say an Intel Mac Pro. And odds are they'll usually run better than they do on a G5. It's, but like I said, and then there's the liquid cooled G5s, which are a whole nother kettle of fish.
Oh gosh, yeah, you don't want to be messing.
I mean, I see people do restorations of those, but you have to buy that, committing to that restoration. If you don't, you're just throwing your money. Might as well light the money on fire.
But as you said, a G3 blue and white G3 tower is a great machine. Or if you can get an iMac, could the lampstand iMacs run OS 9? I think they could.
I think the very first generation of them, the 15-inch ones, could still boot into OS 9. There was another point where those stopped. It was the Rev A ones would, but I still think that machine is not an OS 9 machine. Like, that machine belongs with OS 10.
It's the OS 10 era. Yeah, it's the OS 10.
Whereas the Gumdrop G3s, those you really should stick to OS 9 or OS 8 on them, depending on what you want to run and whatever. But those are still nice machines because, again, they take USB peripherals. You can plug a modern keyboard and mouse into it. You just go and
networking.
They've got They've got Ethernet. They're very easy to. Yes, they don't have floppy drives. Using thumb drives on them is a little tough because they don't have USB 2.0. But that's when you start to become fond of the Mac user's best friend, then and now, the zip drive.
Oh, yes. Good old zip drive.
I mean, that's one thing. Sorry, tell me about your zip drives.
Oh, so I have fond memories of it. I had two.
Oh, really?
I had a parallel port one when I was still on PC, and then I got a USB one when I moved to the Mac. And it's amazing, people think, oh, Apple removed the floppy drive. Yeah, but Apple also made USB mainstream.
They did. And to be fair, in the towers, they included zip drives in the towers. Because, that market, again, zip drives were all the rage amongst the DTP market, just like jazz drives were. On the other side of the room, I have... actually, I bought a zip drive today, as a matter of fact. It was a $2 special. It didn't have a power supply, but it's like, I have power supplies for those. It's actually a combo USB parallel 250 meg zip drive. And it's using one of those funky, tiny parallel connectors, not one of the big Centronics ones.
I remember. Yes, I remember those.
Yeah. I've got multiple flavors. I've got USB Zip 100. I've got SCSI Zip 100s. Again, SCSI zip drives, great for old Macs. They're great. It's amazing how well of a portal those things are. I mean, you can still buy new old stock media that works perfectly fine. I mean, I've gotten... that's one thing about DTP and Macs is that they were real, like, for storage media. If you wanted to launch new storage media, that kind of was the place to go. Like SideQuest drives. I mean, that was the big deal for us back in the day. SideQuest drives, and then the Bernoulli was interesting. I have a Bernoulli drive over there, and then the Zip kind of took over. Like the Zip kind of put SideQuest out of it, and then the Jazz came in, and then the Jazz is, everybody thought
huge. Well, it had so many issues, didn't it?
I know.
Jazz.
People, it's like, we love the Jazz drive, but it's one of those things where, again, like a German car, it's doing more than it was probably engineered to do. So I have a Jazz drive over there that I took out from somebody's 8100 that I, picked apart for parts. And the Jazz drives, they were just not reliable enough. It's like you had to make sure you kept multiple copies of things. But the thing is that there was no better alternatives. CDRs were expensive. Yeah. They were still kind of a ways away, and you could only write to them once.
They were slow.
Like a Jazz drive. I mean, we were still using Jazz discs till like 2006. Like when I was working at a shop, it's like, okay, yep, we still used Jazz drives for certain things, but they were kind of on their way out at the time because, as it was. But like if you needed a removable media, it's like 2 gigs of rewritable, removable media. Thumb drives were just not to the point yet.
It's amazing as well. And of course, the Mac. But there's so many things we could talk about, and I'm definitely going to be reaching out to more of a vintage Mac community. I mean, I might have to talk to you after a show about.
We should do like a roundtable.
Let me talk to you about that after we finish recording, because that's absolutely on the agenda. It's great to see, great to get some advice. And one thing I want to say is there's so many wonderful YouTubers out there.
Yes.
And so obviously we think of Steve from Mac 84, Crazy Ken, Sean from Action Retro. But some of the videos I've really enjoyed have been with sort of the deep dives into the history of things like, and I'll come back to this in a second, but things like those old Power Macs, but also the PowerBook Duo.
Yes.
So Colin from This Does Not Compute did a wonderful video. Now, fun story. The same school, my high school, our art teacher somehow got hold of a PowerBook Duo with the docking station.
Oh, wow.
And he said, look, I don't know how to use this. Can you help me? I'm like, well, I'm not really a Mac guy. But he said, look, take the laptop home with you and play with it.
You and I have a similar story on this front, because when I was in 8th grade, I was lent one of these old, just like I have up here, 100 era PowerBooks. Or like, I have no idea how I managed to do this. I think teachers or whatever just recognize, this kid's good, so for some reason I had it for a week or two for reasons that are not explained to me, but I think maybe they felt it kept me out of greater trouble. I don't know. But yeah, a Duo with a Duo dock. I'm like, wow, that's amazing.
And it was the proper Duo dock, not the mini one. It was the proper, like,
with the new bus slots.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was on his desk. Obviously, he couldn't take that home, but we tried to get it, working for stuff. I also, for a short period, not a Mac technically, but did get to borrow an eMate.
I own an eMate.
There we go. And I think I missed my opportunity, because I think we were actually trying to see whether or not I'd get one through like because of my eyesight, special educational need funding. I think I didn't like it enough to get to keep it. Like,
you know what? The eMate's an interesting thing. It's like, for me, the eMate is more of an object to collect than something to actually use. I mean, if I need something to run Newton stuff, it's there. But it's like, for me, I just think it's cool. It's just one of those things where sometimes I collect things because they're cool. Sometimes I get lucky. Like, that's why, admittedly, That's why I got the Mac TV, because it's not a great Mac and it's a lousy TV, but it is so cool. Like, as opposed to my 2GS, which, I mean, I love that machine. I bought that off of this nice older couple who lived down on the South Shore here in Massachusetts, and they were turbo Apple II people. I mean, this thing. It's funny. I'm not sure your experience with going out and collecting stuff sometimes, but you watch the Facebook marketplaces, you watch the Craigslist, you watch all this stuff to see who's selling what and what's good. I see this listing pop up for a 2GS. There's a 2GS monitors, some floppy drives, and it booted, showed boot screen. And it said, $250 for this 2GS with monitor, drives. There is a hard drive and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, yeah. I happened to see it. I sent an email and said, hey, I'll come pick it up. And she's like, sure. So I come down and they're like, now you're going to have to take this whole collection. And it turned out that it was the 2GS, 3 floppy drives, 2 hard disks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of old Apple II 5.25-inch floppy disks, hundreds of 3.5-inch disks of 2GS stuff, boxes and boxes of parts, software boxes. Just like, I'll send you offline. I'll DM you some of the stuff. Most of that was I had to sort through all. There was an image writer and a bunch of other stuff I had to sort through too. Just my hatchback was just full of stuff. But I got it home and I opened it. I'm like, okay, the 2GS is what we care about. So I go and I clean everything up. Do your whole clean up with everything. And I pop open the 2GS and it's like, this thing has 4 megs of memory, and it has a not the transwarp, but it had a zip chip. So it had like a 12 megahertz zip chip accelerator in it. So I mean, that accelerator by itself is probably worth $250. So like, just the amount of stuff that I got out of, I mean, was crazy. But like, for me, it's like that 2GS. I never had one. There was one in our public library in town I used it once, and I'm like, I really like that machine. And I read the book. There's an Apple IIgs book that you can get that was a really nice read. It's like, I always wanted one of those, and now I got it. And I've proceeded to do absolutely nothing with it except try the sequencer I mean, I've played some games, but the real thing I've tried with this is the sequencer software. And I hope that maybe when people collect their vintage Macs sometimes, that they open up like old Photoshop or old Illustrator or old Page. I know the Amiga Addicts guys tried doing stuff on proper Amiga things, and I think they have since given that up. But I think it was it was nice that they tried.
Yes. You know what? I would love to go back. There are things that I did on my Amiga. Like, I remember doing a bit of homework about trains, and in D-Paint, drawing a high speed Intercity 125. It was not a great image for anyone wondering. I do not have it anymore. But it is, it is fascinating. And thank you so much, Dan. We are coming up on 2 hours of raw record time. And you know what? It's been such a blast to go into that history. Yeah, it's been great. And it just brings back so many memories for me of seeing those Macs in those pre-press offices. And also, one of the reasons I switched to Mac I'll very quickly tell the story. So the reason I switched to Mac is I was trying to edit a wedding video, and my PC just kept dying. It literally died. It was a horrible machine bought from a horrible store. So I borrowed off a friend his G4 PowerBook. So it was an aluminium G4 PowerBook.
One of the later ones, yeah.
Yeah, one of the later ones. And used Final Cut. And I fell in love. And that's what got me to switch. I got when that PC died, it literally died. I was able to get it replaced because they recognised, it was faulty all the way through. And I went into the store and said, okay, I've got this voucher, for credit. I want that iMac. Oh, but sir, it's a Mac. I'm like, yes, I know it's a... And it was an Intel Mac. It was as I say, it was a Core 2 Duo. I said, yes, I know. I want... He says, but you really don't. Here's this nice
that's
HP.
what we've been fighting all these years. An HP,
like,
it's like, that's like the Christmas story. You're the kid, you're asking for your Red Ryder carbine rifle, and they're like, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. How about a nice football? That is literally what they were doing to you. It's like, no, you're the customer. You have the money. It's like, give me my Mac. Shut up and take my money.
And I remember coming home with it, coming back in my car with my dad, because I still live with my mum and dad at this point, and sitting up on my desk, and my mum says, "Oh, that's a nice monitor." I said, "No, well, that's the entire computer." She's like, "Why can't Microsoft do that?" Well,
not for lack of trying.
No, that is true. Anyway, before we wrap up, do you want to where can people find you? Obviously, we know about the podcast, but where can people find you on social media and all that lovely stuff?
Yeah, so like I said, if you want to listen to my the stuff that I write or whatever, you can go to userlandia.com. If you don't want to listen, all the stuff is written out in nice transcript blog posts, or you can subscribe and listen to my dulcet tones, bring them to your ear holes. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at Kefka Floyd. I don't really use Facebook for anything because they are the devil.
Yep.
Yeah, Twitter is basic. I use Twitter as a public instant messenger. I've been on it for 13 years, and that's what I've used it for. And otherwise, I'm on, we do have a Discord for Userlandia. It's pretty quiet these days because, small show, but, I'm around in other places, and, you'll see me pop up here and there. So yeah, just give me a follow over at Kefka Floyd. And if you want to, even tonight, I realize it'll be too late for you. You'll be off in Dreamland. But one thing I do usually on Wednesday, Thursday, and sometimes Saturday nights is we do streaming with a group of friends of mine. Our channel is called Let's Racing Time. And what we do is it's basically just a bunch of guys who get together. We're not really speedrunners. We get together and play games together to race each other and see, we do randomizers. We just wrapped up a Super Mario Brothers 3 a league where we did that. We do randomize. We play random games where we say, hey, I want to see who's the fastest at Mega Man X. And we decide to do that. Or we could just say, like we did on Thursday, we just had a night where we just played City Skylines. And we're just saying, we get a little competitive, say, whose city has the most population right now, or who's got the this or that. But it's an excuse for us to sit around for an hour and a half and play games together and hang out and have a good time. So yeah, that I would say that's where people can find me. And James, what you're doing with your show, you've got a variety of different topics. It's like I tune in each week, or such as it is, and I never know what I'm going to get. It's almost always a pleasant surprise, so it's like you always kind of, keep me on my toes. So, keep up the good work with that.
Oh, thank you, Dan. And that's what we're going for. So the idea of Crosswires is that, we're not a time-sensitive podcast. So one thing I was... Actually, you've made a really good point. Don't forget to go back into our back catalogue.
Exactly.
As Dan said, you'll find something that will interest you. Not all our episodes are retro-based. We have, more modern stuff. We talked... Yeah, hang on.
I think it was the other week you did a HomeKit episode.
Did HomeKit, because we were talking about that in Neil's Discord earlier about HomeKit. But we've done stuff about audio interfaces. I've interviewed the Squadcast CEO. Well, I had a chat with Zach really to talk about this stuff. But my goal with Crosswires, very simple. For those who haven't quite figured this out yet, we want to look at cool and exciting tech, no matter what its age. But basically, we want to get people doing cool things. So that's what we're doing. Now, some housekeeping. For us, we're on social media, again, just on Twitter, CrosswiresMG. If you, for some reason, want to follow me on Twitter, I'm JS Billsborough, and I will spell that at JSBILSBROUGH.
We got to get you an easier handle, man.
Maybe one day. It's kind of where, the name I use everywhere. Anyway, email us, podcast@crosswires.net. We are in the process of working on our Discord. that's going to be just we're going to have a really cool, hopefully, hangout space, a nice, sort of community around that, because Discord's wonderful for stuff like that. We're just working on a few little bits there. We are also working on streaming, so we'll make an official announcement when it's ready, but we are planning some game streaming. It won't be until after I move and everything's set up, but yeah, there's a game I've been playing, Hard Space Shipbreakers. Wonderful game. We plan to stream it, and we plan to do a lot of positive games, so there will be no Fortnite streaming. There will be no Roblox streaming. Those games are out. We're looking for good, genuine games. Anyway, you can find my show notes for this episode at crosswise.net, and head over to crosswise.net/YouTube to see our existing YouTube content. More YouTube content will likely be coming. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Please do like and subscribe. Send us in your comments. You can, of course, comment on the post itself. And if you're a good Pods listener, start a discussion there. And I promise I'll reply to everyone who posts. Have a nice evening.
Have a good one, everybody.